Meditation 2 of the nature of the human mind, and it is more easily known than the body. The meditation of yesterday filled my mind with so many doubts that it is no longer in my power to forget them. And yet, I do not see in what manner I can resolve them. And, just as if I had all of the sudden fallen into very deep water, I am so disconcerted that I can neither make certain of my setting my feet on the bottom, nor can I swim and so support myself on the surface. I shall, nevertheless, make an effort and follow anew the same path as that on which I yesterday entered, i.e., I shall proceed by setting aside all that in which the least doubt could be supposed to exist, just as if I had discovered that it was absolutely false. And I shall ever follow in this road until I have met with something which is certain, or at least, if I can do nothing else, until I have learned for certain that there is nothing in the world that is certain. Archimedes, in order that he might draw the terrestrial globe out of its place and transport it elsewhere, demanded only that one point should be fixed and immovable. In the same way, I shall have the right to conceive high hopes if I am happy enough to discover one thing only which is certain and indubitable. I suppose, then, that all the things that I see are false. I persuade myself that nothing has ever existed, of all that my fallacious memory represents to me. I consider that I possess no senses. I imagine that body, figure, extension, movement, and place are but the fiction of my mind. What then can be esteemed as true? Perhaps nothing at all, unless that there is nothing in the world that is certain. But how can I know there is not something different from those things that I have just considered, of which one cannot have the slightest doubt? Is there not some God, or some other being, by whatever name we call it, who puts these reflections into my mind? That is not necessary, for is it not possible that I am capable of producing them myself? I myself, am I not at least something? But I have already denied that I had senses and body. Yet I hesitate, for what follows from that? Am I so dependent on body and senses that I cannot exist without these? But I was persuaded that there was nothing in all the world, that there was no heaven, no earth, that there were no minds, nor any bodies. Was I not then likewise persuaded that I did not exist? Not at all. Of a surety, I myself did exist, since I persuaded myself of something. But there is some deceiver or other, very powerful and very cunning, who ever employs his ingenuity in deceiving me. Then, without a doubt, I exist also, if he deceives me, and let him deceive me as much as he will. He can never cause me to be nothing, so long as I think that I am something. So that after having reflected well and carefully examined all things, we must come to the definite conclusion that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time that I pronounce it, or that I mentally conceive it. But I do not yet know clearly enough what I am, I who am certain that I am, and hence I must be careful to see that I do not imprudently take some other object in place of myself, and thus that I do not go astray in respect of this knowledge, and that I hold to be the most certain and most evident of all that I have formerly learned. That is why I shall now consider anew what I believed myself to be before I embarked upon these reflections, and of my former opinions I shall withdraw all that might, even in a small degree, be invalidated by the reasons which I have just brought forward, in order that there may be nothing at all left beyond what is absolutely certain and indubitable. What then did I formerly believe myself to be? Undoubtedly, I believed myself to be a man. But what is a man? Shall I say a reasonable animal? Certainly not, for then I should have to inquire what an animal is, and what is reasonable, and thus from a single question, I should insensibly fall into an infinitude of others more difficult, and I should not wish to waste the little time and leisure remaining to me in trying to unravel subtleties like these. But I shall rather stop here to consider the thoughts which of themselves spring up in my mind, and which were not inspired by anything beyond my own nature alone when I applied myself to the consideration of my being. In the first place, then, I consider myself as having a face, hands, arms, and all that system of members composed on bones and flesh as seen in a corpse, which I designated by the name of body. In addition to this, I considered that I was nourished, that I walked, that I felt, and that I thought, and I referred all these actions to the soul. But I did not stop to consider what the soul was, or if I did stop, I imagined that it was something extremely rare and subtle, like a wind, a flame, or an ether, which was spread throughout my grosser parts. As to body, I had no manner of doubt about its nature, but I thought I had a very clear knowledge of it, and if I had desired to explain it according to the notions that I had then formed of it, I should have described it thus. By the body I understand all that which can be defined by a certain figure, something which can be confined in a certain place, and which can fill a given space in such a way that every other body will be excluded from it, which can be perceived either by touch, or by sight, or by hearing, or by taste, or by smell, which can be moved in many ways, not, in truth, by itself, but by something which is foreign to it, by which it is touched, and from which it receives impressions. For to have the power of self-movement, as also of feeling or of thinking, I did not consider to appertain to the nature of body. On the contrary, I was rather astonished to find that faculties similar to them existed in some bodies. But what am I, now that I suppose that there is a certain genius which is extremely powerful, and, if I may say so, malicious, who employs all his powers in deceiving me? Can I confirm that I possess the least of all those things which I have just said pertain to the nature of the body? I pause to consider. I revolve all these things in my mind, and I find none of which I can say that it pertains to me. It would be tedious to stop to enumerate them. Let us pass to the attributes of soul, and see if there is any one which is in me. What of nutrition, or walking? But, if it is so that I have no body, it is also true that I can neither walk, nor take nourishment. Another attribute is sensation. But one cannot feel without body, and besides, I have thought I perceived many things during sleep that I recognized in my waking moments as not having been experienced at all. What of thinking? I find here that thought is an attribute that belongs to me. It alone cannot be separated from me. I am, I exist, that is certain. But how often? Just when I think? For it might possibly be the case, if I ceased entirely to think, that I should likewise cease altogether to exist. I do not now admit anything which is not necessarily true. To speak accurately, I am not more than a thing which thinks, that is to say, a mind or a soul, or any understanding, or a reason, which are terms whose significance was formerly unknown to me. I am, however, a real thing, and really exist. But what thing? I have answered, a thing which thinks. And what more? I shall exercise my imagination, in order to see if I am not something more. I am not a collection of members, which we call the human body. I am not a subtle air distributed through these members. I am not a wind, a fire, a vapour, a breath, nor anything at all which I can imagine or conceive, because I have assumed that all these were nothing. Without changing that supposition, I find that I only leave myself certain of the fact that I am somewhat. But perhaps it is true that these same things, which I supposed were non-existent, because they are unknown to me, are really not different from the self which I know. I am not sure about this. I shall not dispute about it now. I can only give judgment on things that are known to me. I know that I exist, and I inquire what I am, I whom I know to exist. But it is very certain that the knowledge of my existence, taken in its precise significance, does not depend on things whose existence is not yet known to me. Consequently, it does not depend on those which I can feign in imagination. And indeed, the very term feign in imagination proves to my error, for I really do this if I imagine myself a something, since to imagine is nothing else than to contemplate the figure or image of a corporeal thing. But I already know for certain that I am, and that it may be that all these images, and speaking generally, all things that relate to the nature of the body are nothing but dreams and chimeras. For this reason, I see clearly that I have as little reason to say, I shall stimulate my imagination in order to know more directly what I am, than if I were to say, I am now awake, and I perceive somewhat that is real and true. But I do not yet perceive it distinctly enough. I shall go to sleep of express purpose, so that my dreams may represent the perception with greatest truth and evidence. And thus, I know for certain that nothing of all that I can understand by means of my imagination belongs to this knowledge which I have of myself, and that it is necessary to recall the mind from this mode of thought with the utmost diligence, in order that it may be able to know its own nature with perfect distinctness. But what then am I? A thing which thinks. What is a thing which thinks? It is a thing which doubts, understands, conceives, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, which also imagines and feels. Certainly, it is no small matter if all these things pertain to my nature. But why should they not so pertain? Am I not that being who now doubts nearly everything, who nevertheless understands certain things, who affirms that only one is true, who denies all the others, who desires to know more, is averse from being deceived, who imagines many things, sometimes indeed despite his will, and who perceives many likewise, as by the intervention of the bodily organs? Is there nothing in all this which is as true as it is certain that I exist, even though I should always sleep, and though he who has given me being employed all his ingenuity in deceiving me? Is there, likewise, any one of these attributes which can be distinguished from my thought, or which might be said to be separated from myself? For it is so evident of itself that it is I who doubts, who understands, and who desires, that there is no reason here to add anything to explain it. And I have certainly the power of imagining likewise, for although it may happen, as I formerly supposed, that none of these things which I imagine are true, nevertheless this power of imagining does not cease to be really in use, and it forms part of my thought. Finally, I am the same who feels, that is to say, who perceives certain things, as by the organs of sense, since in truth I see light, I hear noise, I feel heat. But it will be said that these phenomena are false, and that I am dreaming. Let it be so. Still it is at least quite certain that it seems to me that I see light, that I hear noise, and that I feel heat. That cannot be false. Properly speaking, it is what is in me called feeling. And used in this precise sense, that is no other thing than thinking. From this time, I begin to know what I am with a little more clearness and distinction than before. But nevertheless, it still seems to me, and I cannot prevent myself from thinking, that corporeal things, whose images are framed by thought, which are tested by the senses, are much more distinctly known than that obscure part of me which does not come under the imagination. Although really it is very strange to say that I know and I understand more distinctly these things whose existence seems to me dubious, which are unknown to me, and which do not belong to me, than others of truth of which I am convinced, which are known to me, and which pertain to my real nature. In a word, than myself. But I see clearly how the case stands. My mind loves to wander, and cannot yet suffer itself to be retained within the just limits of truth. Very good. Let us once more give it the freest rein, so that when afterwards we seize the proper occasion for pulling up, it may the more easily be regulated and controlled. Let us begin by considering the commonest matters, those which we believe to be the most distinctly comprehended, to wit, the bodies which we touch and see, not indeed bodies in general, for these general ideas are usually a little more confused. But let us consider one body in particular. Let us take, for example, this piece of wax. It has been taken quite freshly from the hive, and it has not yet lost the sweetness of the honey which it contains. It still retains somewhat of the odor of the flowers from which it has been culled. Its color, its figure, its size are apparent. It is hard, cold, easily handled, and if you strike it with the finger, it will emit a sound. Finally, all the things which are requisite to cause us distinctly to recognize a body are met within it. But notice that while I speak and approach the fire, what remained of the taste is exhaled. The smell evaporates, the color alters. The figure is destroyed. The size increases. It becomes liquid. It heats. Scarcely can one handle it. And when one strikes it, no sound is emitted. Does the same wax remain after this change? We must confess that it remains. None would judge otherwise. What then did I know so distinctly in this piece of wax? It could certainly be nothing of all that the senses brought to my notice, since all these things which fall under taste, smell, sight, touch, and hearing are found to be changed, and yet the same wax remains. Perhaps it was what I now think, viz., that this wax was not the sweetness of honey, nor the agreeable scent of flowers, nor that particular whiteness, nor that figure, nor that sound, but simply a body which a little while before appeared to me as perceptible under these forms, and which is now perceptible under others. But what precisely is it that I imagine when I form such conceptions? Let us attentively consider this, and abstracting from all that does not belong to the wax, let us see what remains. Certainly nothing remains excepting a certain extended thing which is flexible and movable. But what is the meaning of flexible and movable? Is it not that I imagine that this piece of wax, being round, is capable of becoming square, and of passing from a square to a triangular figure? No, certainly it is not that, since I imagine it admits of an infinitude of similar changes, and I nevertheless do not know how to compass that in the infinitude by my imagination, and consequently this conception which I have of the wax is not brought about by the faculty of imagination. What now is this extension? Is it not also unknown? For it becomes greater when the wax is melted, greater when it is boiled, and greater still when the heat increases. And I should not conceive, clearly, according to the truth, what wax is, if I did not think that even this piece that we are considering is capable of receiving more variations in extension than I have ever imagined. We must then grant that I could not even understand, through the imagination, what this piece of wax is, and that it is my mind alone which perceives it. I say this piece of wax in particular, for as to wax in general it is yet clearer. But what is this piece of wax which cannot be understood excepting by the understanding or mind? It is certainly the same that I see, touch, imagine, and finally it is the same which I have always believed it to be from the beginning. But what must particularly be observed is that its perception is neither an act of vision, nor of touch, nor of imagination, and has never been such, although it may have appeared formerly to be so, but only an intuition of the mind, which may be imperfect and confused as it was formerly, or clear and distinct as it is at present, according as my attention is more or less directed to the elements which are found in it, and of which it is composed. Yet, in the meantime, I am greatly astonished when I consider the great feebleness of mind, and its proneness to fall insensibly into error. For although, without giving expression to my thought, I consider all this in my own mind, words often impede me, and I am almost deceived by the terms of ordinary language. For we say that we see the same wax, if it is present, and not that we simply judge that it is the same, from its having the same colour and figure. From this I should conclude that I knew the wax by means of vision, and not simply by the intuition of the mind, unless by chance I remember that, when looking from a window, and saying I see men who pass in the street, I really do not see them, but infer that what I see is men, just as I say that I see wax. And yet what do I see from the window but hats and coats, which may cover automatic machines? Yet I judge these to be men. And similarly, solely by the faculty of judgment, which rests in my mind, I comprehend that which I believed I saw with my eyes. A man who makes it his aim to raise his knowledge above the common should be ashamed to derive the occasion for doubting from the forms of speech invented by the vulgar. I prefer to pass on and consider whether I had a more evident and perfect conception of what the wax was when I first perceived it, and when I believed I knew it by means of the external senses, or at least by the common sense, as it is called. that is to say, by the imaginative faculty, or whether my present conception is clearer now that I have most carefully examined what it is, and in what way it can be known. It would certainly be absurd to doubt as to this. For what was there in this first perception which was distinct? What was there which might not as well have been perceived by any of the animals? But when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, and when, just as if I had taken from its vestments, I consider it quite naked, it is certain that although some error may still be found in my judgment, I can nevertheless not perceive it thus without a human mind. But finally, what shall I say of this mind? That is, of myself. For up to this point, I do not admit in myself anything but mind. What then, I who seem to perceive this piece of wax so distinctly, do I not know myself? Not only with much more truth and certainty, but also with much more distinctness and clearness? For if I judge that the wax is or exists from the fact that I see it, it certainly follows much more clearly that I am or that I exist myself from the fact that I see it. For it may be that what I see is not really wax. It may also be that I do not possess eyes with which to see anything. But it cannot be that when I see, or, for I no longer take into account the distinction, when I think I see, that I, myself, who think, am not. So if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I touch it, the same thing will follow, to wit, that I am, and if I judge that my imagination, or some other cause, whatever it is, persuades me that the wax exists, I shall still conclude the same. And what I have here remarked of wax may be applied to all other things, which are external to me, and which are met with outside of me. And further, if the notion or perception of wax has seemed to me clearer and more distinct, not only after the sight or the touch, but also after many other causes have rendered it quite manifest to me, with how much more evidence and distinctness must it be said that I now know myself, since all the reasons which contribute to the knowledge of wax, or any other body whatever, are yet better proofs of the nature of my mind. And there are so many other things in the mind itself which may contribute to the elucidation of its nature, that those which depend on body, such as these just mentioned, hardly merit being taken into account. But finally, here I am, having insensibly reverted to the point I desired. For, since it is now manifest to me that even bodies are not properly speaking, known by the senses or by the faculty of imagination, but by understanding only, and since they are not known from the fact that they are seen or touched, but only because they are understood, I see clearly that there is nothing which is easier for me to know than my mind. But because it is difficult to rid oneself so promptly of an opinion to which one was accustomed for so long, it will be well that I should halt a little at this point, so that by length of my meditation I may more deeply imprint on my memory this new knowledge.